The first day we walked into our new home, everything felt just as I had imagined it in those quiet, hopeful moments when you dream about a place to call your own. The air was different somehow, though I could not have said why. It carried the faint scent of paint and polished wood, the lingering aroma of someone else's life gently pressed into the walls, like an invisible fingerprint of all the small daily moments that had happened here before we arrived. I remember stepping over the threshold, feeling the cold tile under my shoes, my fingers brushing against the smooth doorframe, and thinking, this is it. This is home. The sun was beginning to dip, sending golden threads of light through the large windows that overlooked the front yard. The light fell in soft patterns across the floor, and for a moment, everything felt warm and safe. My mind wandered to the moving boxes stacked neatly in the corner, their brown cardboard sides creased and worn from the trip, their contents filled with the things we had chosen to bring into this new chapter of our lives. I could almost hear the faint whisper of the boxes telling their own story, each one holding pieces of our past, our memories, our little comforts and fragile treasures, now converging in a space that was entirely unfamiliar yet promising. We had toured this house several times before deciding to make it ours, but stepping inside for the first time without anyone else around, without the realtor or the former owner, it felt different. Almost like the walls were breathing, holding their own secrets, waiting for someone to notice. The previous owner had seemed so ordinary, so pleasant, the kind of person who smiled easily, shook hands firmly, and left you with a sense of simple, easy trust. They seemed nice, I whispered to myself, half to calm my nerves and half as a note to remember. Friendly even, in that gentle way that makes strangers feel like old acquaintances. Little did I know, little did I know that those smiles hid something unseen, something just beyond the reach of the ordinary eye, something that would quietly shape the very way I would experience this home in the months to come. As I moved further inside, my eyes traced the familiar lines of what was now our living room. The fireplace sat perfectly centered against the far wall, the mantel bare except for the faint dust of a life recently vacated. It was strange, the way absence felt so present, like the house remembered the people who had lived here before us. I could almost sense them moving through the rooms as I explored, footsteps echoing softly in the hall, a chair slightly askew as if someone had only just risen from it, the faint creak of a floorboard that seemed almost purposeful. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks, weaving stories out of shadows and light. I remember standing by the window, looking out over the small garden the previous owners had tended so carefully. The roses were neatly trimmed, their petals glowing softly in the evening light. I could hear birds settling into the branches, their soft chirping a gentle lullaby to the fading day. Everything was perfect, picturesque even, but there was a subtle tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the unfamiliarity, the way the walls held their secrets close, or the slight feeling that someone had watched this very room countless times, that lives had unfolded here, unobserved, and now it was our turn to occupy the space. As we continued to unpack, carrying boxes room by room, I found myself noticing the little things, the details I had overlooked during our initial visits. The corners of the ceiling were slightly darker than the rest of the room, as if a shadow lingered there long after the sun had passed. The hallway carpet felt softer underfoot than it should have, almost like it had absorbed the footsteps of the past, retaining a faint imprint of lives that had walked this path before us. I opened the cabinets, ran my hands over the shelves, and found the faint fingerprints of someone else's hands lingering, a gentle reminder that this house had stories it had yet to tell. It was in these quiet moments that the house began to reveal its personality, not loud, not demanding attention, but subtle, almost imperceptible. The way a door closed slightly slower than it should, the way the blinds fell at a perfect angle, casting shadows that shifted imperceptibly with the sun's movement. Each small detail combined to form a larger picture, one that whispered to me that the house had a rhythm, a pulse of its own, and that it would take time for us to learn its language. I couldn't help but think back to the previous owner again, their casual warmth, the easy confidence with which they had handed over the keys. "Trust me, it's a great home," they had said, their tone light, almost dismissive of any lingering doubt I might have carried. And yet, standing here, alone in the quiet of the evening, I felt the first twinge of unease, a flutter in my chest that I tried to dismiss as the normal jitters of moving. There was no reason to be wary, no reason at all, and yet the seed of doubt had been planted, subtle as the shadows along the wall. The kitchen was the next room we tackled, boxes of dishes and utensils stacked neatly on the counter. I ran my hands over the cool granite, marveling at the smoothness, the faint sparkle in the stone, but even here, my eyes were drawn to small imperfections. An unusual mark along the backsplash, a faint scratch near the sink. Nothing overtly alarming, nothing that would have seemed strange to anyone else, but to me, it whispered the faint echo of lives lived, of moments observed, of things hidden just beyond the periphery. I shook my head again, trying to steady my thoughts, to remind myself that a house, no matter how alive it seemed, was still just wood and stone, paint and plaster. As evening descended fully and the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky outside, I noticed something else, a faint reflection in the window pane just at the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. It was probably a trick of the light, I reasoned, the last remnants of daylight bouncing off a polished surface, creating a fleeting, ghost-like shimmer. And yet the sensation lingered, a small ripple of doubt that brushed against the back of my mind. Something had been here before us, yes, that much I knew, something unseen, something patient. Even as I tried to focus on unpacking, on organizing, on settling into a routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had a memory. It held on to things in ways that were almost imperceptible, subtle shifts in the air, faint sounds that didn't belong to the walls themselves. Each time I paused, I became aware of these details, footsteps that weren't mine, a slight hum of something mechanical, a subtle pressure in the quiet. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew I was already part of the house's story now, a new chapter that it would absorb silently, waiting to reveal its secrets in its own time. And so, I stood there in the soft glow of the evening light, looking around our new home, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I thought about the previous owner again, about the casual words, the easy smiles, the sense of trust they had inspired. I did not know it yet, but their presence lingered far longer than their departure, imprinted in ways that were not immediately obvious, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to uncover the truth. They seemed nice, friendly even. Little did I know. Little did I know that this was just the beginning, that the quiet walls and polished floors held secrets that would challenge everything I believed about safety, trust, and the sanctity of a home. I could not have imagined the subtle signs I would begin to notice, the small, almost imperceptible hints that would grow into an overwhelming awareness of someone, or something, watching. And yet, in that moment, all I felt was hope. Hope for a new beginning, hope for a place that was ours, hope that the sunlit rooms and soft shadows were just the backdrop for a peaceful, happy life. It was only later, much later, that the first sense of unease would crystallize into something more tangible. For now, all I could do was breathe in the scent of the fresh walls, touch the smooth surfaces of our new home, and tell myself that everything was as it should be. The house was ours now. It would protect us, shelter us, cradle our memories. It was perfect. Or so I thought. The first morning in the new house dawned with a gentle stillness that seemed almost sacred. Sunlight poured through the large, unshaded windows, painting golden streaks across the living room floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, catching the light in their silent dance, as if they were performing for us alone, welcoming us into a space that had been waiting. I remember the smell vividly. The faint, lingering scent of freshly painted walls mixed with the earthy undertone of a home that had settled into itself over the years. It was intoxicating in its own way, the smell of possibility, of new beginnings, of something untouched yet familiar in a way that only houses with history can feel. Boxes were stacked in neat towers around the room, their brown cardboard sides marked with black Sharpie labels indicating their contents. Kitchen, books, clothes, miscellaneous. Each box was a container not only of objects but of memories, little fragments of our lives, carefully folded and packed away, ready to be unpacked and woven into the fabric of this new home. I ran my fingers over the tape sealing the boxes, noticing the small creases and wrinkles, the way some corners had been slightly crushed in the move, and I felt a strange tenderness for these inanimate carriers of our past. Unpacking became a ritual of discovery. Plates were carefully nested in the cabinets, mugs lined up on the shelves, the books placed on the new bookcases in a careful order I could not immediately define, perhaps by weight, perhaps by memory. Each object seemed to carry a piece of home with it, transforming the empty rooms into spaces that slowly began to feel lived in. The floors creaked under my weight as I moved around, the soft groans of the wood speaking of age, of countless footsteps before ours. I imagined the people who had walked these floors before us, their laughter echoing softly in the hallways, their quiet conversations lingering in the corners. There was comfort in the thought, and yet, somewhere deep beneath it, a faint unease stirred, a whisper of awareness that these floors, these walls, had seen more than just furniture and family life. The kitchen was the first place I truly felt the pulse of the home. Sunlight spilled across the countertops, glinting off the smooth granite, highlighting subtle imperfections that made the surfaces feel real, lived in. I ran my hands along the backsplash, feeling the cool tiles beneath my fingertips, noticing a faint scratch near the edge of the counter. It could have been nothing, just wear and tear, but in that moment it caught my attention. It was small, almost insignificant, yet it left a whisper of a thought in my mind. This home had its own story. The cabinets opened and closed with a soft click, but one door did not align perfectly. It hung slightly crooked, a silent hint that perfection was never quite the reality here. As I carried boxes up the stairs, I became aware of the subtle idiosyncrasies of the home. A light fixture that tilted ever so slightly, casting a shadow that never quite lined up with the beam of the sun. A doorknob that resisted the turn of the key, demanding a little more force than expected. Even the placement of furniture left subtle traces of displacement, small gaps where a chair had once sat too close to a wall, marks on the carpet where a table leg had pressed in slightly over time. These minor irregularities might have gone unnoticed in a casual glance, but to me, they were threads in a tapestry I was slowly beginning to see, hints that the home had a memory, and that memory might reach further than I could imagine. There was a quiet rhythm to the day. The sound of our own movements became a melody against the soft creaks of the floor. Boxes shuffled, wrapping paper crinkled, dishes clinked against one another. Even the air seemed alive, moving through the rooms in subtle currents, carrying with it the faint whisper of the previous occupants' lives. It was a home steeped in history, yet untouched in ways that made it feel both inviting and mysterious. Each time I paused to catch my breath, I could almost feel the walls observing, not in a threatening way, but in that quiet, patient way that homes do when they have absorbed countless moments of joy, sorrow, routine, and secrecy. The bedrooms were next, each one with its own personality. The master bedroom, bathed in the soft glow of afternoon sunlight, felt expansive and peaceful. The closet doors slid open smoothly, revealing racks of empty space ready to be filled. Yet there was a slight chill near the far corner of the room, a subtle draft that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just the way the air circulated through the house, but I couldn't ignore the faint sensation of being watched, of a presence lingering quietly behind the surface of ordinary life. The smaller bedrooms carried the scent of the previous owners more strongly, the faint musk of someone's routine, someone's personal life, still imprinted on the walls, carpets, and corners. Even as I unpacked my daughter's toys, arranging them in neat rows, I felt that quiet hum of history beneath my fingers, a reminder that the home had seen more than we could ever imagine. Decorating became both a joyous task and a subtle act of claiming space. Curtains were hung, photographs placed on shelves, rugs rolled out to soften the floors. I chose each object carefully, trying to leave a mark of our family in the house, to make it ours in a way that felt respectful yet intentional. And yet, even as I decorated, I noticed small oddities that didn't make sense. Wires tucked into corners with no apparent purpose, screws in the walls that did not align with anything we had hung, and in one case, a faint circular outline on the wall that suggested something had once been mounted there. It was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention, but it left a small knot of curiosity in my chest, a whisper of doubt that the house was not entirely empty of observation. The living room, once emptied of boxes, felt like the heart of the home. Sunlight poured in, falling across the couch and the rug in warm, shifting patterns. I ran my hand along the back of the couch, noting a faint indentation that suggested someone had sat here before, and for a brief moment, I imagined the previous owner sitting in the same spot, reading, thinking, perhaps unaware that a future family would soon occupy this very space. The sound of our laughter as we arranged the furniture mingled with the soft creaks of the floorboards, creating a harmony that felt almost sacred. And yet, in the background of all this, there was that quiet awareness, a subtle prickle at the back of my mind that perhaps this home remembered more than I wanted to admit. Even the hallways seemed to carry a life of their own. Each door we passed, each step we took revealed small peculiarities: a hinge that squeaked, a shadow that shifted oddly against the wall, a faint mark on the wallpaper that did not match the pattern perfectly. I noticed them, cataloged them in my mind, and then quickly pushed them aside, telling myself that houses always have quirks, that it was normal, that I was just being overly observant in my excitement to make this place ours. And yet, the awareness never fully left me. There was a rhythm to the home, subtle and almost imperceptible, a pulse that seemed to beat quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting for someone to notice. The smell of freshly painted walls lingered everywhere, mingling with the faint odor of old carpet and wood. I inhaled deeply, feeling the sensation settle into my lungs, into my thoughts. The sensory richness of the home, the soft sunlight, the creaking floors, the mix of scents, was almost overwhelming in its familiarity and strangeness. It was as if the house was alive in a way that we could feel, but not yet fully understand. A quiet presence that would continue to reveal itself slowly, patiently, over time. Even minor details became moments of fascination. The way sunlight shifted through the window blinds throughout the day, creating patterns that moved almost imperceptibly. The soft thud of a box being set down, echoing against the walls in a way that felt larger than it should. The subtle hum of electricity in the outlets, faint and consistent, like a heartbeat beneath the stillness. I cataloged them all, noting them mentally, aware that each small detail contributed to the overall sense of the home's personality, its life, and its quiet mysteries. By evening, the house had begun to feel lived in, though it still carried the faint weight of the previous occupants' presence. Our laughter, our footsteps, our voices had begun to layer themselves over the remnants of what had come before, slowly claiming the spaces as ours. Yet even as I admired the way the rooms now reflected our family, I noticed again the small oddities: the crooked doors, the faint outline on a wall, the misaligned light switch in the corner. They were small, almost insignificant, but in my heart, I felt the stirrings of curiosity and unease, subtle yet persistent. As night fell and the first stars appeared in the sky outside, the house seemed to exhale, settling around us like a living, breathing entity. Shadows deepened in the corners, stretching and shifting as the moonlight poured through the windows. I paused in the hallway, feeling the weight of silence, the almost imperceptible sense that the home had absorbed our presence and was now watching, waiting, measuring. I tried to tell myself it was just imagination, that houses do not watch, that floors do not remember. Yet a whisper of doubt remained, tucked into the edges of consciousness, reminding me that there was more to this home than the warmth of sunlight and the thrill of unpacking boxes. And so, we settled in, carrying our boxes, our memories, our hopes into every corner of the house. The excitement of moving, the joy of decorating, the satisfaction of finally claiming a place as our own, all mingled with a subtle, persistent awareness that not everything in this house was as it seemed. Every creak, every shadow, every small oddity was a thread in a tapestry that we were only beginning to perceive, a tapestry that would continue to unravel quietly, patiently, over time. It started with the little things. At first, they seemed inconsequential, almost laughable, the kind of minor oddities that a person might dismiss as fatigue, the stress of moving, or the quirks of a new house. A misplaced remote on the kitchen counter. The small stack of mail that had been set neatly on the table appearing in a completely different room. I remember thinking, I must have moved it myself and forgotten, or perhaps one of the kids had done it while I wasn't looking. But as the days passed, those small occurrences began to pile up, each one layering a subtle sense of unease over the excitement that had accompanied our first weeks in the new house. The first moment I truly paused came one morning when I reached for my phone, which I was certain I had left charging on the nightstand. It wasn't there. I looked under the bed, around the dresser, in the pockets of yesterday's clothes. Nothing. My heart skipped a beat. I asked my husband if he had moved it, and he shook his head. "I haven't touched it," he said, his brow furrowing slightly. I must have been tired, I told myself, imagining that I had set it down in some odd place during the night. But then, when I eventually found it lying face down in the living room, far from any surface I could have possibly used, a cold ripple of discomfort ran through me. It wasn't long before electronics began acting strangely. The smart speaker in the kitchen would turn on unexpectedly, a faint flicker of blue light cutting through the dim morning. Sometimes it would respond to no command at all, playing music I had never asked for or setting alarms that I hadn't activated. The television would switch channels on its own, the screen flickering between shows and static for brief moments, never long enough to be explained by a malfunction, but long enough to be noticed. One evening, while settling in with my daughter to watch a movie, the screen abruptly went black, only to return to the same channel we had been watching seconds earlier, as if someone had briefly paused it from another room. I stared at it, the air around me growing heavier with each unexplained flicker, and the familiar warmth of our new home felt suddenly distant, replaced by a quiet, pervasive tension. Even the small, everyday objects began to betray the sense of normalcy I had tried to cling to. Coffee mugs shifted slightly from their usual spots, towels in the bathroom appeared folded differently, chairs that I had pushed neatly under the table were occasionally left angled strangely. At first, I chalked it up to absent-mindedness or my own forgetfulness, but when I mentioned it to my husband, he raised his eyebrows. "That's odd," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant, as though even he had noticed the subtle disruptions in the rhythm of our home. It wasn't just the objects. The notifications on our smart devices added another layer of unease. A smart doorbell would alert us that someone had walked up to the front porch, even though the camera showed no one there. The motion detectors in the living room would trigger at night, sending a ping to my phone that a presence had been detected, only for me to find the room empty upon investigation. One particularly unnerving evening, I awoke to the sound of the doorbell ringing softly. I reached for my phone, the motion camera feed blinking on, and saw nothing, only the empty steps and the faint glow of the porch light. The sense of intrusion was subtle but undeniable, like a whisper in the dark, reminding me that the house or someone in it was not entirely predictable. Family and friends began to notice too, though their observations were phrased casually, almost offhandedly. My daughter remarked that she thought the living room rug had shifted, her small voice tinged with curiosity and unease. "Mom," she said one afternoon, "the rug isn't where it was yesterday. Did you move it?" I smiled, trying to appear calm, but inside, a ripple of anxiety stirred. "No, sweetie, I don't think I did," I replied, keeping my voice light. She nodded, but the look on her face suggested she was unsettled, sensing a subtle disturbance in our once predictable environment. Friends who came to visit made offhand comments as well. "Your lights flickered just now," one remarked during a casual afternoon gathering, sipping tea on the couch. I laughed nervously, attributing it to electrical quirks in a new house, but I couldn't fully shake the sense that there was something more. Even my husband's mother, who was usually calm and grounded, mentioned that the kitchen faucet had turned on by itself one evening while she was preparing dinner. We dismissed it as a mechanical fault, yet a quiet unease settled into the corners of my mind, persistent and growing. It was during these days that I began to notice patterns, subtle yet consistent anomalies that hinted at a larger hidden presence. The motion sensors seemed to activate more frequently in certain corners of the house. The misplaced objects often followed a predictable path, as if someone, or something, was observing our routines and gently nudging the environment to remind us that we were not entirely alone. The notion made my skin prickle, yet I could not quite name it as fear. It was something subtler, a creeping awareness that our home was behaving in ways that did not fully align with normal logic or expectation. Even mundane chores took on an unsettling dimension. I would place laundry in the baskets, only to find them slightly shifted hours later. Cabinets that I had organized meticulously would appear disordered, the small items inside misaligned in ways that were almost imperceptible but noticeable to the practiced eye. The refrigerator door would not always close flush, and on one occasion, a small jar of condiments had been moved from the bottom shelf to the top. Each occurrence on its own could have been overlooked, dismissed as coincidence, but together, they created a pattern that could not be ignored, a quiet insistence that something was subtly amiss. As days turned into weeks, I began keeping a mental journal of the strange signs. I cataloged them carefully, noting the time, location, and circumstances of each anomaly. The small lights flickering in the hallway, the doors that resisted closure, the slight hum of electronics that seemed to awaken without cause. My husband noticed my meticulousness and asked if I was overthinking, but I could not bring myself to ignore the growing list of incidents. Even he began to pause occasionally, a subtle tension creeping into his expression when lights flickered or the smart devices pinged unexpectedly. There were nights when I would wake to the soft hum of a device I hadn't activated, the low glow of screens casting strange shadows across the walls. I would rise quietly, moving through the hallways with bated breath, checking each room meticulously, only to find them empty. Yet the sense of being observed lingered, subtle and persistent, like a whisper brushing against the edges of perception. I began to notice small reflections in the mirrors that didn't match my movements precisely, fleeting glimpses of light or shadow that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. Visitors occasionally commented on the ambience of the house. "It's cozy, but there's something unusual," one friend said during a dinner, their words light, casual, but carrying an undercurrent of unease. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Was I imagining it? Were these small disturbances simply the quirks of a home that had existed long before us, or was there something more deliberate at play? The question lingered in my mind, unspoken yet persistent, a shadow that followed me through the day and into the quiet of the night. Even the children began to express subtle unease. My daughter, normally fearless, started hesitating before entering certain rooms alone. "Mom," she whispered one afternoon, "I thought I saw someone in the hallway, but no one was there." I knelt beside her, smoothing her hair back and assuring her it was only the light or shadows, yet inside, I felt a tightening in my chest. How could I explain something that I could not yet fully understand myself? And yet, the small anomalies continued, their frequency increasing almost imperceptibly, as though the house itself was testing the boundaries of our awareness, measuring our reactions, and waiting. Even mundane objects became agents of uncertainty. Keys would vanish from the kitchen counter, only to reappear in a coat pocket I had not used in days. Phone chargers would be unplugged, television remotes moved to entirely different rooms. The refrigerator light would flicker, the oven timer would reset spontaneously. I began noticing patterns in these disturbances, subtle alignments that suggested intentionality, a careful observation of our daily routines that went beyond random coincidence. My own mental state began to shift subtly, though I did not admit it even to myself. There was a quiet hyper-awareness, a constant scanning of rooms, a gentle tension underlying even ordinary tasks. I found myself pausing before opening doors, listening intently to the soft creaks of the floor, noting every minor anomaly, every fleeting flicker of shadow or light. The house, once a place of excitement and promise, was transforming in my perception into something alive, something aware, something that held its own secrets tightly beneath the surface. At night, the feeling intensified. The house seemed to breathe around us, the floors whispering with each step, the walls holding a weight of quiet observation. The children would wake occasionally, calling softly from their rooms, and I would rise to check on them, moving through the hallways with heightened awareness. A painting slightly askew, a door left open that I was certain I had closed, a small sound from the attic that did not belong to the wind or the pipes, all of it wove together into a tapestry of subtle unease. Friends visiting in the evenings would sometimes notice it too, though they rarely voiced it directly. "It's a beautiful house," they would say, smiling, but I could sense their hesitations, the slight quickening of their glances, the tiny pauses as they moved from room to room. Even strangers seemed to pick up on something, the odd alignment of furniture, the barely perceptible flickers of light, the hum of devices behaving as though guided by unseen hands. I became increasingly aware of the small details that had previously gone unnoticed. The slight shadows in corners, the gentle draft in closed rooms, the way reflections in windows sometimes seemed off, even for a fraction of a second. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was a presence. A quiet, observing entity that tested our perception, challenged our assumptions, and reminded us that not all anomalies were accidental. The ordinary world we had brought with us, our routines, our schedules, our carefully planned days, was intersecting with something else entirely, something subtle and patient, and I could feel its influence shaping our experience in ways we could not yet name or understand. It was late one evening, the kind of quiet that pressed gently against your eardrums, making the smallest noises feel amplified, urgent, almost accusatory. The house had settled into its usual rhythm, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of a floorboard, the soft whisper of air moving through the vents. I was alone, the rest of the family having gone to bed, and I had lingered in the living room, tidying up after a long day of unpacking and organizing. At first, I noticed it in a way that seemed almost mundane. A small cord tucked behind the bookshelf, one I hadn't seen before. It was thin, black, and nearly invisible against the dark wood, coiled tightly as though it had been intentionally hidden from view. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the wire, and for a fleeting second, I considered that it might be part of a cable I had overlooked while organizing. But something about its placement felt deliberate, calculated, positioned in a way that suggested someone had carefully concealed it, yet wanted it to remain connected to something, some device I could not yet see. Heart pounding, I crouched down, trying to trace the cord to its origin. It disappeared behind the base of the shelf, looping subtly along the floor until it seemed to vanish into the wall. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I could feel every heartbeat echoing in my chest, loud and insistent, as if the house itself were aware of my discovery, holding its breath alongside me. The air felt heavier suddenly, charged, as though a presence was waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to recognize what had been hidden in plain sight all along. I slowly moved the bookshelf forward, each step careful and deliberate, the floorboards groaning softly beneath my weight. The cord led to a small, circular hole in the wall, so perfectly drilled that it might have been overlooked by anyone unfamiliar with the subtle art of observation. And then I saw it, the glint of a lens catching the faint light from the lamp I had left on, a tiny, unblinking eye staring back at me from its hidden perch. My breath caught in my throat, an involuntary gasp escaping my lips, and I stumbled backward, almost knocking over a chair in my sudden, unsteady retreat. Time seemed to slow as I stared at the lens, struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with the reality I had always assumed, that this house was our sanctuary, our safe place, our home. The lens reflected nothing but the faint glow of the room, yet its presence was enough to make the space feel violated, hollowed out. I ran my hand through my hair, cold sweat running down my temples, as disbelief settled over me in waves. How had I not noticed this before? The small anomalies, the strange flickers in electronics, the misplaced objects, they had all been signs, subtle warnings that I had ignored or rationalized. And now, the truth was staring me in the face, undeniable and horrifying. I sank slowly onto the couch, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to calm the rising panic inside me. The emotional weight was suffocating, fear, anger, a deep sense of betrayal all intertwining in a heavy knot that pressed against my chest. The realization that someone had been watching us, perhaps from the very first days we had set foot in this home, made my skin crawl. Every sound, every movement, every private moment we had spent here now felt exposed, invaded, stolen. I could feel the violation keenly, a gnawing ache in my stomach that refused to be ignored. I traced my thoughts back, recalling the small, strange signs I had noticed. The misplaced objects, the electronics behaving oddly, the subtle shifts in furniture, the unaccountable pings from our smart devices. Each incident, once easily dismissible, now took on a sinister clarity. They were not coincidences. They were breadcrumbs, leading me, unwittingly, to this precise moment of discovery. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms, as a rush of anger surged through me. How dare someone violate our home, our private space, our family's sanctuary? How dare they pretend to be ordinary, friendly, trustworthy, while secretly turning our lives into something observed, catalogued, and possibly manipulated? I rose again, moving cautiously around the living room, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every surface. I noticed the faint outline of another small hole near the ceiling, partially hidden behind a curtain rod. My pulse accelerated once more as I approached it, the realization dawning slowly. This was not an isolated incident. The hidden camera lens was part of a network, a series of deliberate placements, each designed to capture moments without our knowledge, without our consent. The very walls that had seemed warm and welcoming now felt oppressive, the air heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Kneeling on the floor, I examined the cord again, feeling the subtle vibrations that suggested it was connected to a power source, to a device somewhere beyond immediate sight. The thought that someone had gone to such lengths, hidden these instruments so carefully, made my mind spin. Who? Why? For how long? The questions ricocheted through my thoughts, each one more urgent and terrifying than the last. I could imagine countless scenarios, each one worse than the previous, and with each passing second, my sense of security unraveled further. My body reacted instinctively, adrenaline coursing through my veins, making my movements sharp, precise, alert. I checked other areas of the room, lifting cushions, inspecting the furniture, tracing wires along the baseboards. My eyes fell on another tiny lens, partially concealed behind a smoke detector, its black surface nearly blending with the shadows of the ceiling. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I pressed a hand to my mouth to stifle a gasp. The realization that our home had been compromised in multiple locations, that our most private spaces were not as private as I had believed, struck me with a force that left me momentarily frozen in place. I sank back onto the floor, leaning against the couch, and let the emotions wash over me. The fear was sharp, immediate, primal. The anger simmered beneath it, a steady, burning heat that fueled my thoughts. The sense of violation cut deeply, a wound that seemed to penetrate not just the walls of our home, but the very trust I had placed in the previous owner, in the familiar, in the belief that a home was a sanctuary. Each emotion was layered, complex, and overwhelming, intertwining in a dense, almost tangible fog that made it difficult to think, to breathe, to even move. Memories of the past weeks flooded back, small anomalies that had seemed inconsequential at the time, each one now revealed as a clue to the larger, disturbing truth. The misaligned furniture, the electronics, odd behaviors, the minor shifts in daily life, they had all been indicators of observation, deliberate and persistent. My chest tightened as I recognized the pattern, the meticulous care with which this surveillance had been executed. It was no accident, no oversight, no harmless mistake. It was intentional, invasive, and profoundly violating. I remember the way the room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing closer, shadows deepening in the corners as though they were aware of my discovery. The familiar sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creaks of the floor, the soft whisper of the vents, transformed into an oppressive soundtrack, a reminder that the space we had called home was layered with observation, secrecy, and intrusion. I ran my fingers through my hair again, cold sweat forming at my temples, as disbelief, horror, and a deep, simmering rage intertwined into a force that both paralyzed and propelled me forward. I examined the first lens again, noticing the faint reflection of the room, the subtle glint of the tiny glass eye staring unblinkingly at me. It was almost surreal, as though the house had transformed from a place of warmth and familiarity into a stage for a hidden, unseen audience. The thought of how long it had been there, how much of our private life had been recorded, how many moments had been stolen from us, made my stomach twist into knots. My hands shook as I traced the edges of the small hole in the wall, the cool plaster pressing against my fingers, grounding me in the terrifying reality of the discovery. I moved carefully around the room, each step deliberate, checking every possible hiding spot, every corner, every shadowed surface. The intensity of the fear and anger grew with each new finding, each subtle indication that we had not been alone in our own home. I could almost hear a faint pulse beneath the floorboards, the rhythm of my own heartbeat intertwining with the lingering presence of those unseen eyes. Every object I touched, every glance I cast, seemed charged with a new, urgent significance. The house had transformed from a safe haven into a web of secrets, surveillance, and violation. Even the smallest details were suffused with meaning now. The slight shift of a curtain, the unusual placement of a lamp, the faint outline of a cable running along the baseboards, everything was connected, everything was intentional. I felt the weight of realization pressing down on me, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made it difficult to breathe, to think, to imagine how we would move forward from this point. The discovery was not just a moment. It was a revelation, a tectonic shift in the foundation of my sense of security, my trust in the home, and in the ordinary kindness of others. The moment I decided to contact the former owner, I felt a mixture of resolve and dread, as if acknowledging the situation out loud would make it undeniably real. My hands shook slightly as I dialed the number, the phone feeling heavier than it should have, almost like a physical weight pressing against my palm. I remembered the cordial, friendly tone of their voice during the home sale, the smiles, the assurances, the gentle laughter, and contrasted it with the dark knowledge I now carried. This was no longer just a polite, transactional relationship. It was about betrayal, intrusion, and violation. When the phone connected, I heard their familiar voice, light and casual as though nothing had changed. "Hello," they said. That single syllable, ordinary and unremarkable, sent a ripple of unease through me. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice, trying to balance the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. "We need to talk about the cameras," I said quietly, deliberately, letting the words hang in the air between us. The tone was controlled, but underneath my pulse raced, each heartbeat hammering against my ribcage like a warning drum. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, almost casually, the former owner replied, "Oh, I forgot the hidden cameras, but..." The words hung in the air, unfinished, deliberately trailing off as though they wanted to give me just enough pause to wonder, to fear, to question everything. My stomach tightened, my breath caught. I could feel the icy tendrils of disbelief wrapping around my chest, a combination of horror and incredulity that made my vision blur slightly. How could someone admit this so casually? How could a confession of such a profound violation be delivered with such nonchalance, almost as though it were a minor oversight, a trivial lapse in judgment? I sank into the nearest chair, my mind spinning. Shock, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal collided within me, each one amplifying the other. The home we had dreamed of, the space we had filled with our laughter and memories, had been compromised in ways that I was only beginning to grasp. Every small anomaly, every flicker of electronics, every misplaced object, it all pointed back to this moment, this confession, and now it made sense in a way that was both terrifying and enraging. The former owner's tone did not change. It remained casual, almost dismissive. "I didn't think anyone would notice," they continued, their voice calm, almost flippant. "I just left them there. It's not like it was a big deal." I could feel the walls of my home pressing in around me, the betrayal folding over me like a suffocating blanket. The audacity of such a statement, the casual disregard for our privacy, sent a shiver of cold fury down my spine. How could someone rationalize something so invasive, so fundamentally wrong, as not a big deal? I tried to speak, but my voice faltered. I opened my mouth, closed it, swallowed hard. Do you understand what this means?" I managed to ask, my tone trembling despite my best efforts to maintain composure. My pulse thrummed in my ears, loud enough that it almost drowned out their reply. There was a brief silence on the line, punctuated only by the faint, almost imperceptible hum of background noise on their end, perhaps a TV, a fan, a distant conversation. Then came the explanation, vague and carefully constructed, as if they were walking a tightrope between honesty and deflection. "I just wanted to keep an eye on things. Make sure the house was okay after I moved out. I didn't mean any harm. Honestly, I thought it would be fine if they stayed. It's just I forgot." Their words were like shards, cutting into the fragile sense of trust I had clung to, each one leaving a deeper wound in the fabric of my security. I stared at the wall across from me, my hands clutching the armrests of the chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The calm, methodical tone of the former owner, the way they framed their actions as harmless or forgetful, twisted the knife of violation even further. My mind raced through every previous interaction, every detail that now seemed loaded with hidden meaning. The casual smiles during the handover, the easy assurances about the neighborhood, the subtle confidence that had made me let my guard down. Each memory now felt tainted, colored by the knowledge of deliberate observation, of intimate moments captured without consent, of privacy stolen. I tried to process the emotions flooding me. Anger surged first, hot and immediate, demanding action, justice, confrontation. But layered beneath it was a quieter, more insidious fear, a recognition that our home, the sanctuary we had believed in, had been infiltrated in ways that we could not fully quantify. How long had they been observing? What had they seen? The questions spiraled in my mind, each one more harrowing than the last, each one feeding the growing sense of violation that pressed against my chest like a heavy stone. My hands began to shake, and I ran them through my hair, gripping strands as though doing so could anchor me to reality. The former owner's voice continued, calm, almost indifferent. "I didn't think anyone would notice. Honestly, I forgot. I didn't mean to invade your privacy, I was just curious." The casual admission, the effortless blending of justification and dismissal, felt like a mockery. It was not only an invasion, it was a psychological manipulation, a twisting of morality designed to minimize the impact of their actions while leaving the responsibility of outrage squarely on me. I remembered the subtle signs I had ignored, now fully illuminated by this confession. The misplaced objects, the flickering lights, the mysterious notifications from smart devices, all had been breadcrumbs leading to this moment, hints that I had been observing but had not yet understood. Each realization intensified my sense of betrayal. It was not just a question of the physical intrusion, of cameras hidden behind walls or ceilings. It was the deliberate breach of trust, the manipulation of perception, the slow erosion of the sanctity of our home. The former owner continued speaking, their voice threading between casualness and defensiveness, weaving a web of moral ambiguity that made it impossible to simply dismiss or resolve the situation. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay after I left. I've always cared about this house. I didn't expect you to find them. Honestly, I forgot." There it was again, the word forgot, repeated like a shield, a flimsy defense against the gravity of the violation. My mind rejected it, could not accept it. Forgetting did not account for the meticulous placement, the careful concealment, the foresight required to maintain the surveillance in the first place. I pressed further, my voice steadier now, fueled by rising indignation. "You don't get it," I said. "This isn't about the house. This is about us. You invaded our lives, you watched us, you violated the very concept of privacy." I felt a tremor in my throat, a mixture of fear and righteous anger that made the words almost physical, palpable. I could almost hear the walls of the house echoing them back, confirming the truth of my statement. There was a subtle shift in the former owner's tone then, a brief flicker of defensiveness beneath the casual exterior. "I didn't mean for it to be invasive," they said, voice softer, yet still veiled with ambiguity. "I just wanted to, be sure everything was okay." It wasn't personal. I didn't think about how it would feel. The words felt hollow, insufficient, a weak attempt to justify a transgression that was deliberate, invasive, and deeply personal. I paused, letting their words hang in the silence, feeling the weight of the encounter pressing down on me. The emotional spectrum I navigated in that moment was dizzying: shock, horror, anger, fear, violation, disbelief. All layered, twisting, bleeding into one another until they became almost too heavy to bear. My hands remained clenched, my knuckles white, my heartbeat loud and insistent in my ears. Every logical part of me wanted to demand answers, justice, explanation. But another part, quieter and more careful, recognized the futility of confrontation in its traditional form. The former owner continued, almost conversationally, "I really didn't mean to cause any harm. I just forgot. Maybe it was careless of me, but it wasn't malicious. I thought I was helping in my own way." There it was again, the attempt to reframe violation as concern, to disguise manipulation as benevolence. My stomach churned as I recognized it for what it was, an effort to minimize accountability while maintaining control over the narrative, leaving me in a liminal space between outrage and confusion, betrayal and disbelief. I could feel the walls of my home around me, once a sanctuary, now suffused with a new awareness, a new weight. The house seemed to breathe differently, more heavily, almost in sympathy with my own tumultuous emotions. Every object, every shadow, every familiar corner was now imbued with the knowledge that our privacy had been stolen, our trust betrayed. And yet, the confrontation had not provided answers, clarity, or relief. It had only deepened the tension, the moral ambiguity, the sense that the world I had trusted, our home, our neighbors, our previous encounters, was far more complex, far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The mornings after the discovery were different. They carried a weight I had not anticipated, a heaviness that pressed against my chest and made even the simplest movements feel deliberate, cautious, almost calculated. I woke slowly, lingering under the warm comforter longer than usual, my mind already scanning the house for signs, for anomalies, for traces of what had been taken from us. The sunlight streaming through the windows no longer felt purely comforting. It was streaked with suspicion, shadows twisting in ways that seemed purposeful, as if the house itself was aware that I had discovered its secrets. I began to notice every little sound, every minor shift, with an intensity I had never known before. The creak of the floorboards beneath my feet in the hallway no longer signaled familiarity. It triggered a flicker of unease, a momentary surge of adrenaline. The hum of the refrigerator became something more than background noise. It became a measure of normalcy, a gauge of whether the house had returned to its previous rhythms, or if, somehow, the subtle presence of observation lingered still. Each sound was catalogued in my mind, stored alongside 1,000 small questions that had no easy answers. Even the act of moving through the rooms felt altered. I walked more deliberately now, conscious of every step, every glance, every object I touched. I found myself checking the placement of items multiple times, adjusting slightly, then stepping back to observe if anything felt out of alignment. The paranoia was subtle at first, a hesitation before opening a door, a cautious glance around the corner, a repeated confirmation that locks were engaged, but it deepened quickly, becoming a constant undercurrent in my day-to-day existence. I installed new locks on every door, tested the security system multiple times a day, and changed passwords for every device, smart or otherwise. Each action was meant to restore a sense of control, to reassert ownership over a space that had been violated. Yet even with these precautions, I could not completely silence the voice in my head, the quiet internal monologue that whispered doubts and fears. What if they didn't leave everything behind? What if there's still something watching? The intrusion had reshaped the very way I perceived privacy. I became hyper-aware of personal space, noticing how the light fell on certain areas, how shadows lingered in corners, how reflections in mirrors sometimes seemed skewed, almost untrustworthy. The familiar rooms of our home, once a source of comfort, now carried the faint trace of surveillance, a ghostly residue that I could neither ignore nor fully confront. I moved through each room with care, my actions deliberate, almost ritualistic. Checking behind furniture, inspecting corners, tracing cords, lifting cushions, peering behind curtains. These were small acts, yet they carried profound emotional significance, a reclaiming of territory, a subtle assertion that I would not allow the violation to define our lives completely. Sleep became a complicated ritual. I found myself double-checking locks on doors and windows before bed, a habit I had never known before. The children's rooms were inspected repeatedly, the blankets adjusted, the nightlights strategically positioned. Each check was a reassurance to myself as much as to them: you are safe. You are protected. We are reclaiming our space. Yet even in the quiet of night, the mind refused to rest. Every shadow, every flicker of movement outside the window, every creak in the old floorboards kept my senses on edge, alert to anomalies that may or may not exist. The trauma had shifted my perception of normal life. Ordinary activities, making breakfast, folding laundry, reading in the living room, were now tinged with a layer of vigilance. My internal dialogue, the voiceover of my thoughts, became almost constant, guiding each action, weighing risks, scanning for threats. I never thought moving would feel like stepping into a trap. I would tell myself quietly in the mornings, voice low, reflective, almost a whisper against the walls of the home. A home should be safe. A home should be ours. But how can it be ours when the past intrudes in such intimate ways? Even mundane encounters felt altered. I paused longer before answering the door, scanning the porch, checking for anything out of place. Packages were inspected meticulously, deliveries were accepted with caution. The world outside our home seemed to demand the same scrutiny I had learned to apply within it. I became attuned to subtleties, how people moved, how their eyes shifted, how casual words might carry hidden intent. The violation had not only affected our domestic space, but had stretched outward, coloring my interactions with the larger environment. I noticed how these changes affected my family as well. My children became more aware, quieter, tentative in their movements. They watched me, learning the patterns of caution, the subtle adjustments I made in response to my fears. Conversations in the house shifted. We spoke in softer tones, more deliberate, as if the walls themselves could carry words beyond our understanding. I had become both protector and observer, balancing vigilance with the desire to preserve normalcy for those I loved. The emotional weight was exhausting. Fear intertwined with anger, violation mingled with determination, and paranoia wrapped itself around every action, every thought. The internal monologue served as both guide and tormentor. Are you overreacting? Maybe it was just an oversight. Or maybe you haven't seen everything. Are you sure you've checked every corner? The questions multiplied, echoing in my mind, creating a complex tapestry of doubt and resolve that shaped every moment of daily life. I began documenting patterns, small anomalies, subtle irregularities I noticed in the home even after securing it. Notes were scribbled in journals, photos taken of corners, angles, cords, and shadows. It was both methodical and obsessive, an attempt to regain control over a reality that had been fundamentally altered. Each entry, each observation, reinforced a central truth: the violation had occurred, and though we could take measures to protect ourselves moving forward, the past could not be erased. Despite the vigilance, moments of emotional collapse were inevitable. I would pause mid-task, staring at a wall, a shadow, a reflection, feeling the weight of fear and violation pressing in. Tears came silently at times, a private acknowledgement of the depth of the trauma we had endured. "We should have been safe here," I whispered, voice trembling. "We should have been able to trust." And yet, amid the fear, there was also a growing sense of resilience, a slow and deliberate reclaiming of agency over our lives. Even social interactions were colored by the experience. I became more discerning, more cautious in who I trusted, more aware of the subtle power dynamics in conversation. The casual warmth I once extended to neighbors and acquaintances was now measured, filtered through the lens of vigilance and prudence. It was a difficult balance, maintaining openness without vulnerability, preserving relationships without risking intrusion. But it became necessary, a protective adaptation to an altered reality. The house itself became a mirror for my internal state. Every creak, every light flicker, every shadow in the corners was imbued with significance. I walked through rooms deliberately, noticing how objects were placed, how furniture aligned, how cords ran along the baseboards. Even the smallest details, the tilt of a picture frame, the slight hum of a device, the pattern of sunlight across a carpet, were examined, assessed, and catalogued. These actions were not obsessive, they were necessary, an attempt to regain equilibrium in a space that had been fundamentally compromised. Internal dialogue continued to dominate my perception. You are safe. You are careful. You are reclaiming your home. Don't let the past dictate the future. At times, the voice was calm and instructive. At others, it trembled with the residue of fear, a reminder that trauma leaves echoes that do not fade easily. The mental and emotional labor of vigilance was taxing, yet it was also empowering, a slow and deliberate reconstruction of control, agency, and safety. Even seemingly ordinary tasks became rituals of reassurance. Doors were checked and rechecked, windows verified, cameras tested, security systems monitored. My children observed these routines, learning caution, awareness, and resilience, while also carrying the unspoken weight of the intrusion into their sense of safety. Each small measure, each deliberate action, was a testament to the ongoing process of emotional recovery, a quiet assertion that we would survive, adapt, and reclaim our home. Yet, amid all this, there were fleeting moments of vulnerability, when shadows played across the walls, when a sound echoed unexpectedly, when a reflection seemed slightly off. In those moments, the internal dialogue would soften, admit fear, acknowledge the lingering violation. It's okay to be afraid. You were wronged. This is not your fault. These moments were crucial, a recognition that emotional reflection is not just about vigilance, but about self-compassion, the slow rebuilding of trust in oneself, one's family, and one's environment. I began journaling extensively, allowing thoughts to flow unfiltered onto paper, recording fears, observations, strategies, and reflections. I never thought moving would feel like stepping into a trap. I wrote one evening, the words flowing with both sorrow and determination. But here I am, learning to navigate the new landscape of safety, trust, and personal agency. The house may have been violated, but it does not define us. We reclaim it with awareness, caution, and care. Each entry became a thread of continuity, a method of processing, a ritual that intertwined practical vigilance with emotional acknowledgement. It took weeks, maybe months, to begin understanding the depth of what had happened, to sift through the emotions, the fear, the anger, and slowly start framing lessons in a way that didn't feel like mere cliché. I remember one quiet morning, standing at the kitchen window, the sun spilling gold across the counter, the house humming softly in the background, and thinking, this is our home now. But what does it mean to truly feel safe again? The first lesson emerged almost accidentally, from the simplest act of observing my surroundings with renewed attention. I had always assumed that moving into a new house was a fresh start, a clean slate. The trust extended to the previous owner was implicit. I had taken their word, their demeanor, their friendly smiles at face value. Now, I understood that instincts are a powerful compass. There were subtle signs I had dismissed. The slight misalignment of furniture during the walkthrough, the faint hum of devices in corners, the little moments of hesitation in the former owner's tone when discussing certain rooms. These cues, almost invisible to the casual observer, carried meaning. Trust your instincts, I told myself over and over, not as a mantra, but as a tangible, lived reality. Practical lessons wove themselves naturally into this understanding. I learned the importance of thoroughly inspecting every corner of a new home before settling in. Not just the walls, floors, and appliances, but the smaller, overlooked details, the electrical outlets, vents, smoke detectors, and behind large furniture. A camera lens can be hidden in places that seem mundane. A cord can run along the baseboard, unnoticed until you know what to look for. Slowly, methodically, I developed a checklist in my mind, each point grounded in experience rather than theory. Inspect, verify, question, and observe. Another subtle lesson was the value of patience when reclaiming control. After discovering the hidden cameras, I realized that impulsive reactions could sometimes exacerbate fear rather than resolve it. Locking doors, installing security systems, adjusting routines, these acts were necessary, but they were also steps in a process that required thoughtfulness and attention. I learned to approach each precaution deliberately, combining practical measures with emotional reflection. Don't let fear dictate actions, I reminded myself. Fear is useful as a signal, but it must be balanced with calm and strategy. The importance of boundaries became increasingly clear. The violation we experienced had been rooted in someone else's disregard for limits, their sense of entitlement to observe what was ours. I began to see how vital it was to establish boundaries not only in physical spaces, but also in interactions, communications, and even personal assumptions. For example, installing cameras and monitoring devices wasn't about paranoia, it was about reasserting control over our environment. Checking the locks multiple times was an obsession. It was a reaffirmation that our space, our privacy, and our sense of safety were non-negotiable. Boundaries, I realized, are both protective and empowering. Trust, I learned, is nuanced. It is not something given blindly. It is earned, verified, and maintained. Our experience taught me that even familiar faces, friendly gestures, and seemingly innocent assurances could mask motives or oversights. This doesn't mean distrust everyone, but it does mean that trust must be conscious, layered, and reinforced through observation and discernment. Every handshake in a transaction, every smile carries context, and it is our responsibility to read the subtle language of behavior, tone, and gesture. The narrative of this experience also highlighted the intersection of vigilance and resilience. Living under the shadow of violation could have been paralyzing, yet slowly, I learned to integrate safety practices into our lives without letting fear dominate our daily routines. Small rituals, checking the perimeter of the house, verifying devices, keeping an eye on deliveries, became integrated into our routines, not as burdens but as protective measures. I found a rhythm where vigilance was balanced with the comfort and warmth of home life, teaching my children by example that caution does not mean fear, and awareness does not mean obsession. One subtle, often overlooked lesson was the value of documentation. From the initial discovery, I began keeping notes, what I noticed, when, and how it made me feel. Observing patterns, capturing anomalies, even noting the psychological impact, helped me regain a sense of control. Documentation is not about paranoia, it is about creating a record that empowers decision-making. It allows reflection, strategy, and insight. I could look back and say, yes, I observed this. Yes, it mattered. And yes, I responded with clarity. Communication also emerged as a crucial thread. While the confrontation with the former owner was shocking and emotionally charged, it underscored the importance of addressing difficult situations directly yet thoughtfully. Setting boundaries, asking questions, demanding accountability, these actions are vital in navigating breaches of trust. At the same time, I realized that some responses, no matter how calculated or careful, cannot fully satisfy the need for closure. Sometimes the lesson is in asserting agency rather than receiving acknowledgement. I also learned about self-compassion in the aftermath of trauma. It is easy to spiral into guilt, wondering if one should have noticed earlier, reacted differently, or prevented the violation. But self-compassion allowed me to recognize that mistakes and oversights are human. Awareness comes through experience, and resilience grows from learning rather than blame. I was cautious, observant, and ultimately took action. I reminded myself, letting the recognition of my own agency soften the sting of violation. The experience reshaped my perception of the ordinary. Everyday routines, the act of brewing coffee in the morning, reading a book in the living room, tucking my children into bed, were now infused with a heightened sense of presence. I noticed details I had previously ignored: the warmth of sunlight on the countertop, the subtle creak of the floor underfoot, the faint scent of baked goods lingering in the kitchen. These small observations became part of the practice of reclaiming life, of asserting that ordinary moments can coexist with vigilance, that joy and caution are not mutually exclusive. Reflecting further, I realized the subtlety of psychological impact. Trauma does not always manifest as dramatic fear or panic. It often appears in minor adjustments: the way I lock doors, the placement of furniture, the paths I walk across the house. The small life changes, double-checking locks, monitoring devices, observing shadows, are not merely habits. They are expressions of survival, careful calibrations of daily life that communicate safety to oneself and one's family. Recognizing the significance of these small actions transformed them from gestures of paranoia into tools of empowerment. Another lesson involved recognizing the interplay between past experiences and present decisions. Each subtle sign I had overlooked, the flickering lights, the misaligned objects, the curious notifications, was a thread connecting past oversight to present awareness. By acknowledging the lessons embedded in those small events, I could weave a narrative that turned confusion into clarity, suspicion into insight, and violation into a framework for vigilance. Practical advice surfaced naturally from this reflection. Inspect everything carefully, not just the obvious corners and appliances, but also the overlooked nooks and crevices. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, investigate it. Establish boundaries clearly, consistently, and thoughtfully. Document unusual occurrences, maintain observation logs, and integrate safety practices into daily routines in ways that feel organic rather than intrusive. Maintain balance. Vigilance should coexist with normalcy, fear should be tempered with rationality, and routines should provide structure without paranoia. I found that sharing these lessons subtly with friends and family helped to reinforce them without sounding preachy. A casual remark about checking smoke detectors, a gentle suggestion to review security systems, an anecdote about noticing small anomalies. These acts conveyed experience without overstepping, teaching awareness through lived example rather than lecture. Storytelling became a tool for imparting wisdom, a bridge between personal experience and communal understanding. Emotionally, the process of reflection also involved reconciling with uncertainty. I had no definitive answers about motives, intentions, or full scope of observation. Yet I learned that peace does not require certainty. It requires preparation, awareness, and conscious reclamation of agency. Accepting that some things cannot be controlled or predicted allowed me to focus on what could be managed: our home, our routines, our sense of safety, and the emotional resilience of myself and my family. One subtle yet powerful insight was the role of mindfulness in recovery. By observing the present, listening to sounds, noticing light, tracking minor changes, I could anchor myself amidst the anxiety and fear. Mindfulness did not erase the violation, but it provided a framework to live in the aftermath with clarity and purpose, to reclaim moments of peace and joy while maintaining a careful awareness of potential risks. I also noticed a shift in empathy and perspective. Having experienced violation firsthand, I became more attuned to the vulnerabilities of others, the silent fears, the small anxieties, the private moments of uncertainty that often go unnoticed. This awareness deepened my compassion, not only for my family, but for the broader community, reinforcing the idea that vigilance and care are intertwined with understanding and kindness. Finally, I realized the overarching lesson. Life will always carry uncertainty, and homes, though deeply personal, can be sites of both joy and vulnerability. By observing carefully, setting boundaries, trusting instincts, integrating safety into daily routines, and reflecting on experiences thoughtfully, one can navigate that uncertainty without being consumed by it. Each step taken in awareness is a step toward reclaiming agency, security, and emotional balance. I never thought I would learn so much from a house I thought was mine in its entirety, I whispered one evening, standing in the quiet living room as shadows stretched across the walls. Yet here I am, more aware, more vigilant, and more resilient than I could have imagined. The lessons were subtle, threaded into every corner of our lives, guiding us forward with caution, insight, and the quiet assurance that even in the wake of violation, we could reclaim our space, our privacy, and our peace. Even after weeks and months had passed since the discovery, a subtle, almost imperceptible unease lingered in the corners of the house. It wasn't always obvious, not at first glance. Some days, the home felt ordinary, warm, and welcoming again, as if the shadows had lifted and the air had regained its natural rhythm. But then, in the quiet moments, when the children were asleep, when the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen, when sunlight streamed at an odd angle through the curtains, I would feel it. That faint, almost imperceptible sensation that we weren't entirely alone, that the house held more secrets than I had uncovered. I walked the halls slowly one evening, my bare feet whispering across the polished wood floors. The faint creak of the boards under my weight sounded louder than usual, as though the house itself were holding its breath. I paused in front of the living room mirror, staring at the reflection of myself, my posture tense, eyes scanning every shadow. Was it the light catching the corner of the room, or was it something else? My mind quivered at the question. The discovery of hidden cameras had taught me that even ordinary things could harbor unexpected intrusions, and now every shadow, every flicker, every reflection carried the potential for revelation. I began to notice small anomalies again, objects slightly out of place, a cord that seemed to run where it shouldn't, a faint reflection in a window that didn't match my movements. Rationally, I knew that these could be coincidences, the remnants of normal household life, or simply my heightened awareness after the trauma. Yet emotionally, they were undeniable triggers, sending shivers down my spine, tightening the muscles in my neck and shoulders, making my pulse quicken without reason. The house had become a psychological maze, its walls filled not just with physical structure, but with layered suspicion, memory, and lingering doubt. Nighttime was the most challenging. I would lie in bed, listening to the subtle creaks and groans of the old house, the faint whistle of wind through gaps in the windows, the distant rustle of leaves outside. My gaze often drifted toward corners where light barely touched, wondering if some small device had escaped my attention. The act of sleeping became a negotiation between the desire for rest and the instinctual drive for vigilance. Every glance at a shadow, every faint sound became amplified, interpreted, cataloged in the mental ledger of things to watch, things to question. I began to perform routine checks almost unconsciously. Doors, windows, locks, cameras, vents, cords, smoke detectors, each inspected, adjusted, and rechecked with deliberate care. It became a subtle choreography, an invisible dance between caution and daily life. At first, these actions felt protective, empowering, a reclamation of territory. Over time, however, they also carried a quiet tension, a reminder that the home had been violated once and could potentially harbor further secrets. Every repetition was a thread connecting the past to the present, weaving vigilance into the fabric of our lives. Even the children began to mirror these behaviors, though not consciously. They would glance at corners before entering a room, hesitate before opening drawers, glance behind themselves before moving quickly through a hallway. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but their awareness reflected the undercurrent of our shared experience. I reminded myself that vigilance had to coexist with normalcy, that the home must still feel like home despite the residual tension. Yet the question remained, had we truly uncovered everything? Sometimes, in quiet reflection, I would sit in the living room and recount the sequence of events in my mind, as though retelling the story could illuminate any missed details. The discovery, the confrontation with the former owner, the emotional aftermath, they played repeatedly in my thoughts, each iteration revealing new layers, new possibilities. Small anomalies were reinterpreted, re-examined. I could almost sense the house holding secrets in its structure, waiting silently to reveal them if only I were patient enough, or unlucky enough, to stumble upon them. The former owner's words echoed still, haunting in their casual dismissal. I forgot the hidden cameras, but the trailing pause had lodged itself in my mind, refusing to let go. What else had they forgotten? What other devices, other intrusions, other subtle manipulations remained hidden, waiting for discovery? Rational thought reminded me that some things are unintentional, that the casual tone may reflect genuine oversight rather than malice. Yet emotional intuition whispered constantly, check again. Observe carefully. There is more here than meets the eye. Even everyday objects became sources of doubt. A clock that didn't quite align, a smoke detector slightly off-center, a vent grill that seemed newer than the others, all potential hiding spots for devices, all potential witnesses to our lives. I moved through these suspicions with measured caution, aware that obsession could creep in at any moment, but equally aware that ignoring intuition could leave us exposed. The delicate balance between vigilance and anxiety became a new rhythm, a silent tension embedded in the structure of our home. I found myself reflecting not just on the house, but on trust itself, how it can be both a protective shield and a vulnerability. We had trusted the previous owner implicitly, believing in the simple assurances of friendliness, honesty, and ordinary human decency. Yet trust had been breached in ways that left deep emotional scars. Now, I approached every interaction, every new acquaintance, every situation with measured awareness. Not fear, not cynicism, but attentiveness, an active calibration of intuition and observation. The psychological landscape of the home shifted subtly, affecting sleep, movement, and thought patterns. I noticed how I would pause mid-step, examining corners and angles without conscious effort. I would replay memories of prior anomalies, reanalyzing them for missed signs. Even mundane activities, like checking mail or opening the pantry, were imbued with layers of awareness I hadn't possessed before. The house was no longer merely a dwelling. It had become a mental terrain, a landscape of observation, memory, and careful reflection. Conversations with family reflected this ongoing tension. I would casually remark on small adjustments, like checking locks or adjusting furniture placement, embedding practical advice into our routines without overtly alarming anyone. The children absorbed these lessons subtly, developing a shared awareness that was both protective and instructive. It was a silent acknowledgement that the world, and our home, could carry unseen layers, and that preparedness was a form of empowerment. Even the most familiar spaces began to feel subtly transformed. Shadows were deeper, corners more enigmatic, reflections in glass and mirrors more carefully observed. I developed a habit of pausing before entering rooms, scanning the space in a quiet ritual of awareness. Sometimes it was rational, sometimes irrational, but it had become a necessary practice, a method of reclaiming control over a space that had once been compromised. There were fleeting moments when I would catch myself imagining scenarios: cameras hidden in appliances, cords running behind baseboards, subtle devices capturing moments without our knowledge. Rationally, I understood that not every anomaly signified surveillance. Yet emotionally, the lingering doubt persisted, like a quiet echo threading through the house, reminding me that discovery is never fully complete, that awareness is a continual process. Even interactions with technology became fraught with subtle suspicion. Notifications, software updates, and background noises from smart devices were examined with measured attention. I could almost sense the residual footprint of observation in every electronic hum, every subtle ping, every anomaly that hinted at imperfection. The tools that had once felt ordinary and convenient now carried layers of potential risk, and awareness became as much mental as it was physical. As time passed, the tension settled into a rhythm, though never fully dissipating. The home was ours, but the past intrusion had left an indelible mark. I had regained control over daily routines, safety measures, and interactions, yet the subtle question lingered. Was there something I had missed? Something still hidden, quietly observing, silently recording, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The thought was never far, a quiet companion to vigilance, a shadow coexisting with everyday life. Sometimes I would wander the house at night, the soft glow of the lamps illuminating corners and surfaces, my mind scanning for anomalies, my senses tuned to the faintest irregularities. The faint reflection of a picture frame, the misalignment of a vent cover, the slight hum of electronics, each became a potential thread to unravel, a subtle reminder that discovery is often iterative, layered, and never fully complete. And always the former owner's words haunted me. I forgot the hidden cameras, but the trailing implication, the pause that seemed deliberate, left me with a lingering question that refused resolution. What else did they leave behind? The thought was simple, almost casual, yet profoundly unsettling. It threaded through my reflections, my routines, my vigilance, and my quietest moments, embedding itself in the very fabric of our lived experience. Even now, as I move through familiar spaces, as I watch the sunlight cast patterns across the floors, as I listen to the hum of appliances and the whisper of air through vents, the question surfaces unbidden. What else did they leave behind? It is not a question born of paranoia alone. It is a residue of lived experience, a subtle, persistent tension that blends memory, awareness, and reflection. The house feels safe, and yet it is impossible to fully dismiss the possibility that some element of intrusion remains, quietly integrated into the walls, the ceilings, the corners, and the shadows. Even after months had passed since the cameras were discovered, the house never quite felt ordinary again. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just residual fear, that the creeping sense of unease was a natural response to a past violation. But as days became weeks and weeks stretched into months, I realized that what I felt wasn't simply fear. It was an ingrained vigilance, a subtle awareness woven into every action, every glance, every step. The past intrusion had changed the rhythm of our home, its energy, and even the way I perceived light, sound, and movement. I found myself listening more carefully to the creaks of the floorboards at night, to the faint hum of electronics, to the wind brushing against windows. There was a sharpness to perception that I hadn't known before, a heightened attunement to anomalies, irregularities, and tiny inconsistencies. The faint tilt of a picture frame, the subtle misalignment of a vent, or even the way sunlight cut across a room at a certain angle could trigger a moment of pause, a mental check to ask myself if the house was fully secure, if the previous violation had left other traces I hadn't yet uncovered. Even ordinary routines became imbued with caution. I double-checked locks, inspected windows, reviewed the positions of furniture, monitored devices, and made note of subtle changes. I noticed the children doing the same, sometimes without thinking, mimicking my careful scanning, pausing at doorways, peeking around corners. It was subtle, just a glance here, a hesitation there, but it reflected the emotional residue of our experience. The house had taught us vigilance, but it had also taught us that security isn't guaranteed, that safety requires active attention and deliberate action. I often found myself replaying the confrontation with the former owner in my mind. Their casual admission, "I forgot the hidden cameras," but was like a shadow that refused to lift. The pause at the end of that sentence was deliberate, calculated, or perhaps simply careless. Either way, it left a question suspended, unresolved, echoing in every room I walked through. What else did they leave behind? I asked myself this quietly, whispering the thought like a mantra as I moved through the house. The question was both simple and profound, shaping every action, every glance, every instinctive movement. Nighttime was the most challenging. Even with the security system in place, with doors locked and cameras positioned, sleep carried a tension I hadn't anticipated. I would lie awake listening to faint creaks, distant hums, and even the soft rustle of leaves outside. My gaze often wandered toward corners where light didn't reach fully, shadows that seemed thicker than they should be. Sometimes it was irrational, sometimes instinctual, but I had learned that even rational thought could not entirely remove the residue of intrusion. The house, my home, now contained layers of awareness and memory that could not simply be erased. There were nights when I would perform routine checks almost unconsciously. Walking slowly through the hallways, I would inspect each room, glancing behind furniture, peering at vents, touching walls to check for unusual textures. I traced cords, reviewed devices, and even looked at the angles of mirrors and reflective surfaces. Each movement was deliberate, a quiet ritual of vigilance that had become embedded in the fabric of daily life. Even when the rest of the family slept soundly, I would continue these checks, driven by both caution and the unspoken question, could there be more we haven't seen? The shadows themselves became unpredictable companions. I noticed subtle variations in the way light and shadow played across walls and floors, slight shifts that could indicate nothing or something. A reflection in a glass surface might be entirely normal, or it might hide a detail unnoticed at first glance. I had learned to trust the tension these moments evoked, using them as a guide rather than dismissing them outright. It's okay to pause, to observe, to question, I reminded myself silently. Better safe than sorry. Even in broad daylight, the house carried reminders of the past intrusion. Small details, misaligned furniture, subtle scuff marks, faint shadows, triggered memories of the hidden cameras and the emotional impact of discovery. Each anomaly prompted me to reflect on the boundaries we must maintain, the vigilance we must practice, and the subtle measures necessary to preserve privacy and control. I had transformed ordinary observations into a structured form of awareness, a framework of mental and emotional checks that balanced caution with daily life. The children's awareness, though not explicitly discussed, mirrored my own. I noticed subtle behaviors, hesitations before opening doors, glances toward corners, careful movements across rooms. They were not fearful, not overtly anxious, but observant. Our shared experience had subtly instilled vigilance, a learned attentiveness that blended instinct with conscious awareness. I reminded myself that this vigilance was protective, empowering, and ultimately necessary, even if it introduced a quiet tension into our daily routines. Conversations with friends and neighbors became filtered, too. I found myself observing microexpressions, subtle shifts in tone, and small behaviors that might reveal hidden intentions. The intrusion had altered my perception of trust. I no longer took words and gestures at face value. Instead, I observed, listened, and reflected. Trust, I realized, is earned, maintained, and confirmed through consistent behavior rather than assumed. This perspective, though cautious, was not cynical. It was pragmatic, a framework for navigating relationships and interactions without being blindsided. I began journaling these reflections, both as a coping mechanism and as a form of subtle investigation. Each note recorded observations, anomalies, thoughts, and emotional reactions. The act of writing allowed me to clarify patterns, identify triggers, and process lingering anxiety. It also served as a quiet testament to agency, proof that despite violation, we could reclaim control through awareness, reflection, and deliberate action. Even in uncertainty, we can assert ourselves, I wrote repeatedly, reminding myself of resilience, persistence, and vigilance. The former owner's lingering influence, through both the admission and the suspended pause, persisted in my awareness. What else did they leave behind? The question was never fully answerable. It threaded through daily routines, minor observations, and reflective moments, embedding itself in both conscious thought and instinctual vigilance. It was a shadow, a companion, a silent reminder that intrusion, once experienced, leaves traces beyond the physical. The emotional and psychological imprint remained, shaping perceptions, actions, and the subtle rhythms of life within the home. Even seemingly innocuous objects became potential sources of unease. A new appliance, a vent, a decorative object, each could hide secrets, could contain elements left behind that escaped initial discovery. I examined them thoughtfully, gently, without panic, understanding that careful observation was a form of empowerment rather than fear. It was a subtle dance between rational caution and emotional prudence, an ongoing process that reshaped my perception of the environment, the house, and the world beyond it. Days flowed into weeks with this quiet tension underlying every moment. I noticed patterns, the subtle misalignments, the faint reflections, the brief creaks in unusual places, and I cataloged them internally. Even when family life was ordinary, playful, filled with laughter and routine, the awareness persisted. It was a shadow layer beneath the surface of normalcy, a reminder that vigilance and ordinary living can coexist, intertwined but balanced. I began noticing mental triggers as well. Certain sounds, the glint of sunlight off reflective surfaces, the faint hum of devices, even minor irregularities in wall textures could ignite a surge of adrenaline, a flicker of doubt, a momentary pause. I learned to channel these reactions into careful observation, rather than panic. Pause, assess, act deliberately became a mantra, a method for translating instinct into protective measures without succumbing to fear. Even social interactions were subtly reshaped. I observed body language, tone, and behavior more carefully, not out of paranoia but out of awareness. The experience had taught me that boundaries, attention, and careful observation are forms of empowerment, protecting both personal space and emotional integrity. Trust was no longer implicit. It was constructed, maintained, and confirmed through deliberate interaction and mindful observation. As months went on, the house felt both familiar and unpredictable. Each room carried the memory of violation, yet also the weight of reclamation. Small acts, repositioning furniture, checking locks, monitoring devices, scanning shadows, became part of the rhythm of living. The home had transformed into a landscape layered with awareness, experience, and subtle tension. The past intrusion could not be erased, but it could inform vigilance, caution, and presence. And always, that question persisted, quiet but unrelenting. Even now, I sometimes wonder, what else did they leave behind? It was a question with no answer, a lingering thread woven through every shadow, every reflection, every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the vents. The house, our sanctuary, held secrets beyond the obvious, and the memory of intrusion ensured that vigilance, reflection, and cautious attention remained permanent companions. Even as weeks turned into months, the house refused to feel entirely like home. On the surface, everything seemed normal: the sunlight streaming through windows, the soft hum of appliances, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, a subtle tension lingered, almost imperceptible but persistent, threading itself into every movement, every glance, every breath. The discovery of the hidden cameras had left a mark, an invisible scar, and it had taught me that even familiar spaces can harbor secrets, waiting quietly for the unsuspecting eye. Mornings began with a ritual of vigilance. The first sound I heard, the low whir of the refrigerator, the gentle rustle of leaves outside, the distant hum of traffic, was catalogued in my mind, evaluated, and filed. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, every faint vibration in the walls, every glimmer of light on a reflective surface became significant. These ordinary details now carried meaning, charged with the potential to reveal hidden truths. I had learned through experience that the smallest anomaly could indicate the presence of something unseen. Even the air itself seemed to carry whispers of the past. I would walk through the rooms slowly, pausing to inspect corners, vent covers, and the angles of mirrors. I traced the cords along baseboards, lifted cushions, and examined the spaces behind furniture. Each act was deliberate, methodical, almost ritualistic. They were small gestures of control, reclaiming territory that had been violated. Yet every careful movement was tinged with unease, a subtle acknowledgement that the house still held secrets that had yet to be uncovered. The former owner's words haunted me more than I could admit. I forgot the hidden cameras, but the pause at the end of that sentence echoed endlessly in my mind, a fragment suspended in time, pregnant with implication. What else had been left behind? Was it possible that not all devices had been accounted for? That some small, inconspicuous mechanism still observed us without our knowledge? I could not dismiss the question, nor could I fully satisfy the nagging curiosity. It lingered, quiet and insistent, threading itself into the fabric of daily life. Night brought its own challenges. Sleep was no longer a refuge but a negotiation. I would lie in bed, listening to the faint creaks, hums, and sighs of the house, alert to every minor shift. Shadows seemed to move differently, stretching and retreating in ways that suggested consciousness. Occasionally, a reflection in a window or mirror caught my attention, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined a lens observing, recording, capturing fragments of life I assumed were private. Rational thought reminded me that these sensations were echoes of trauma, heightened vigilance born of past violation, but emotional intuition whispered, "Check again. Look carefully. There may be more." The children's awareness mirrored my own, though subtly. I noticed the way they hesitated before opening doors, glanced around corners, or lingered at thresholds. They were not overtly fearful, but observant. Their instincts had absorbed the lessons of vigilance silently, without need for explanation. The home had become a classroom of caution, its architecture teaching awareness through small, repeated actions. Pause, observe, consider, proceed. I realized that these subtle behaviors were as much a legacy of the intrusion as the measures I had taken: locks, cameras, routines. The trauma had rippled outward, shaping behaviors and perceptions beyond the initial moment of discovery. Even in broad daylight, anomalies caught my attention. A vent grill slightly misaligned, a faint scuff mark on a wall, the angle of sunlight across a table, each became significant. My eyes scanned for patterns, inconsistencies, hidden details. Objects that once seemed mundane now appeared suspect, potential hiding spots for devices or mechanisms that might have gone unnoticed. The home was no longer merely a dwelling. It was a landscape layered with memory, observation, and uncertainty. I developed a series of internal protocols to manage this heightened awareness. Check locks and windows multiple times, monitor devices, inspect corners and surfaces, note anomalies in a mental ledger. Each protocol was not just precaution but therapy, a means of reclaiming a sense of agency in a space that had been violated. I repeated these routines until they became almost automatic, part of the fabric of daily life, yet each repetition carried the quiet question: am I missing something? The former owner's lingering influence haunted interactions with friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. I observed micro-expressions, subtle changes in tone, slight hesitations. Trust, once implicit, was now a deliberate act, built through observation and validation. It was not cynicism, nor was it fear, it was vigilance. The past intrusion had reshaped not only our domestic space, but the lens through which I interpreted the world. Every interaction carried potential hidden layers, subtle cues that might reveal intention, oversight, or secrecy. The house itself seemed to participate in this psychological tension. Floors creaked differently in certain rooms, shadows lingered in corners long after light had shifted, mirrors reflected angles that seemed subtly off. I traced these patterns obsessively, seeking anomalies, testing hypotheses, validating instincts. Sometimes, a faint reflection or a tiny shift in object placement would spark a surge of adrenaline. Each time I reminded myself, observe calmly, assess carefully, act deliberately. Fear was not the goal, awareness and control were. Even small objects, the tilt of a picture frame, the alignment of a clock, the positioning of a lamp carried significance. Every minor deviation prompted reflection, analysis, and verification. Was it normal household movement? Or had something been subtly altered, a device placed for observation, a trace left behind by someone else's oversight? Rational thought suggested probability, but emotional memory insisted on caution. The home was layered with ambiguity, and I had learned to live within it without succumbing to panic. Conversations within the family adapted subtly. I embedded lessons of vigilance in casual remarks. Check locks, notice small changes, observe the environment. These were not meant to alarm, but to teach awareness, to integrate precaution into daily life naturally. The children absorbed the lessons without overt instruction, demonstrating how lived experience can shape behavior quietly and effectively. Awareness became part of the home's rhythm, a silent, unspoken thread binding us together in caution and resilience. Even technology, devices once trusted, became a source of reflection. Every notification, every update, every minor anomaly in operation prompted observation. I found myself questioning the ordinary, evaluating patterns, tracing anomalies to their source. Devices that once felt neutral or convenient now demanded scrutiny. This vigilance was not obsessive but necessary, a recalibration of awareness in a space where past intrusion had eroded implicit trust. As the months passed, I noticed how deeply the psychological impact had woven itself into perception. Everyday moments, pouring coffee, reading in the living room, walking through hallways, were framed by observation. Shadows, reflections, sounds, and light carried significance. Minor irregularities prompted reflection and verification. The home had become both sanctuary and site of cautious vigilance, a landscape where memory, perception, and awareness intertwined. I began documenting anomalies in journals, noting dates, times, observations, and emotional responses. Each entry created a thread of continuity, a means of processing, and a record of agency. The act of writing was both therapeutic and investigative, reinforcing the importance of deliberate observation and conscious reflection. It also allowed me to track patterns, subtle changes, and lingering uncertainties, proof that vigilance could coexist with life, and that ordinary routines could integrate precaution organically. The question that lingered above all else refused to dissipate. Even now, I sometimes wonder, what else did they leave behind? It was simple, yet profound, echoing through every shadow, every reflection, every minor anomaly in the house. The past intrusion had created a permanent layer of awareness, a psychological imprint that could not be erased. The home, though ours, was never entirely predictable, never fully knowable. Even during moments of ordinary family life, meals, games, laughter, conversations, the awareness persisted quietly, threading through actions and interactions. Shadows were scanned subconsciously, corners were noted, minor sounds catalogued. The home carried memory, the faint echo of intrusion, and a lingering question: have we truly discovered everything? Even small, seemingly mundane objects carried weight. A book on a shelf, a candle on a table, a chair slightly askew, each could hide subtle traces, remnants of oversight, devices left behind. The mind catalogued these possibilities, blending observation with imagination. Each potential anomaly prompted reflection, careful inspection, and minor adjustments. The house was alive with unseen layers, waiting silently to reveal truths that might never fully emerge. Nightly routines became rituals of observation. Walking through hallways, inspecting corners, verifying locks, monitoring devices, scanning reflections, adjusting minor objects, each act intertwined vigilance with habit, anxiety with routine. The past intrusion had created patterns of awareness that were now second nature, shaping daily life, interactions, and even perception itself. Each action carried quiet reassurance, yet simultaneously acknowledged the possibility of hidden elements still present. Even the quiet hum of life outside, cars, distant voices, wind through trees, was interpreted through a lens of observation. Subtle patterns, small anomalies, and fleeting irregularities were noted mentally, catalogued, and reflected upon. The world beyond the house became an extension of vigilance, as the past violation had reshaped perception not just within the home, but in the environment surrounding it. Internal dialogue became continuous, guiding behavior and shaping perception. Check again. Observe closely. Notice the shadows. Look behind reflections. Pay attention to angles and light. Nothing is too small to inspect. These reminders were neither obsessive nor fearful. They were protective, reinforcing awareness without collapsing into panic. They were a subtle, persistent echo of lessons learned, internalized through experience and reflection. Even as normal routines resumed meals, reading, conversations, the underlying tension persisted. Shadows seemed slightly deeper, reflections subtly altered, faint sounds registered with heightened attention. Awareness had become a permanent companion, shaping perception, action, and thought. The home was ours, yet it carried traces of another presence, past intrusion, and lingering uncertainty. And still, the question endured, quietly threading through all observation, reflection, and routine. Even now, I sometimes wonder, what else did they leave behind? It was never fully answerable, yet it refused to fade. It lingered in shadows, in reflections, in minor anomalies, and in the subtle rhythm of daily life. The home had been violated, reclaimed, and restructured, but uncertainty remained, a quiet, persistent, and unavoidable companion.